kickstart today's events, we are joined by Dr. Joseph Toscano, who's driven all the way a few hours to come and be here today, so thank you, Joe. Dr. Joe Toscano is a Melbourne-based medical practitioner, broadcaster, and anarchist. He's also the host of 3CR's long-running program, Anarchist World, this week, and editor of the Anarchist Age Weekly Review, as well as the spokesperson for Anarchist Media Institute and a community activist. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Toscano.
Thank you. Look, that's all. It's all like technology, you know what it's like. At least this isn't one of those boring things they do on the internet. What do they call it? Webinar, that type of thing. At least it's real human beings. I can feel the heat and the sweat and the anticipation. Now, you can't do that on a webinar, can you? No. Right. I am suited up today for a good reason. This is, in Italian, we call this la bella figura. Now, if you look at Fantine, he is suited up. And if you look at pictures of the activists in the 20s and 30s, they're all suited up for one good reason. Because they were part of the community. It was good enough for the ruling classes to get dressed up. And a bella figura, it's good enough for us. So in honour of those men and women I'll be speaking about today, I have stood it up, and I hope you'll understand why we're so elegant. Now, I'm going to try to... I'm not here as a historian, and I'm not here as an academic. But I'm here as an activist and an anarchist. And the problem with Australia is that history begins when we wake up in the morning. If we look at the reaction to a significant number of people in this country to the fact that this was quite a brutal colonisation process, you understand that history begins when you wake up. When you look at the way the trade union movement has been pushed asunder through legislation where it is illegal to take action, strike action outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period, and individual workers can be and have been fined $10,000 a day for being part of a wildcat strike. You begin to understand when you say you're a unionist and people think you're a criminal, you begin to understand how history can be distorted. So what I try to do in these presentations, and I've done many of these presentations, but this is the first one on this particular subject. What I try to do, if you go to the YouTube channel, josephtoscano.com, I look at the radical tradition in this country since the beginning of colonisation. The various groups, some English speaking, some non-English speaking, that have been involved in groundbreaking radical action which has improved the lives of all of us here in 2026, which have been written out of the pages of this country's history. The known can't be unknown. The unknown is a blank canvas. And if we don't know our history, we allow other people to write it for us in the way they want to write it, without even consulting us. Ask any First Nations person and they'll tell you what it's like to be written about, to be discussed without being involved. And the same story, the same principles apply to radicals in this country since 1788. They write our history because it's unknown. We don't even know our own history. And if we go to that YouTube channel I suggested, I do my best. And why do I do it? not because I want to do a PhD. I've got a doctorate of medicine. I don't need a PhD to walk behind, the doctorate of medicines, in an academic procession. You can get the joke, that's all right. Obviously, you're not academics. But some of you are. So, what am I going to talk about today? Let's get to the point, Joe. I'm going to talk about two things. The anti-fascist struggle in Australia by Italian immigrants between the two world wars. I'm going to talk about civilian internment, where 15% of the 30,000 Australians that lived in this country were interned as enemy aliens. And then I'm going to join the French, attempt to join the French together and invite you to the ceremony at the end of the year that we have been battling with for over 15 years. So, who are these people? Why were they here? We did have a Right Australia policy. Southern Europeans were described as black. And if you look at some of the original items which I looked at, you've got Southern European, then you've got brackets, and then you've got white. So why did they allow all these Italians into the country in the 1920s? And it's all interlinked. There was work which was described as being too hard for white workers. And this was mainly the sugarcane industry in North Queensland. Initially, they used Kanaks to do the work. Kanaks were indentured labourers. But when Australia federated on the 1st of January 1981, after the White Australia policy came into legislation, the second piece of legislation was the Kanak Deportation Act. And over 20,000 Kanaks were deported from this country. Some had been here for 20, 30 years. If you were a Kanak and you could escape into northern New South Wales, you didn't get deported because of the sympathetic New South Wales government. And many of the names you hear in rugby league today, if you're a rugby league fan, are descendants of these original Kanaks. The second thing is, the First World War was a total disaster. It was a war fought by workers at either end of the Beta for the glory of God, King and country. Go back to the original sources. It wasn't about freedom, it wasn't about democracy, it wasn't about defending the country. In that war, there were 5 million people on this continent. About 70,000 Aboriginal people in our Torres Strait who had survived the genocide, and almost 5 million people, mainly Europeans, apart from North Australia, who were living in this country. Of the million men that were eligible for military service, 420,000 volunteered. Look at the pictures when war was declared. People clamouring at the town hall to become volunteers to fight the war, to end the war, a great adventure. Of those 420,000 men who volunteered, 62,000 died in the European killing fields. 8,000 in one day, that's Australians, in the Battle of the Somme. Another 60,000 came back destroyed by their experiences and war wounds and died of their war wounds within a decade of coming back. And the extraordinary effect that this war had on families and labour sources around the country. You cannot lose almost over 10% of the male working population without the country grinding to a halt. So they needed migrants. They needed people to do the work the Kanaks were doing. They needed people to do the work which was being done in the new factories which were being established. And Europeans didn't want to come here. British people didn't want to come here. But Italians wanted to come here because they saw the beginning of a fascist movement. They saw the March on Rome. They'd been involved in the 1921 factory strikes which went nowhere. They saw the increase in repression. Many of them were on hit lists as the Italian fascist state gained more and more institutional power. More and more Italians were looking for a way out. And they came to this country. They were allowed to migrate, although they were Italians or Greeks or Maltese or Spanish, who were not considered to be Europeans under the White Australia policy. And they came here to do the work that nobody else wanted to do. So, I want to honour 4 men I met during just before and after the Australian Anarchist Centenary celebration in 1986. And I've got little pictures of them here, which maybe you can hand around if there's enough. And these were men who are now dead, who were anarchists. There was Boris Franceschini, Raffaele Turco, Armando Ceccarini, and Bruno Vanini. These were the survivors of that period, who survived till the early 80s. These were the men and their partners who were ostracised in this community, ignored, marginalised, pushed aside. So today we will speak about not just these men, but men who were actively involved in the anti-fascist struggle in Australia. People like Francesco Camagnola, Valentino Cicotti, Isidoro Bettazzone, Francesco Fantini. Most of these came from Veneto, near the Austrian border. Many of them have been involved in World War I, and let's not forget in World War I, Italy was on the right side, and over 600,000 Italians died on the Austrian border fighting the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We remember the Battle of the Somme, but we don't remember those battles in the other parts of Europe. People like Francesco Camagnola, who escaped here as a refugee in 1922, arrived here with a shirt on his back. He left behind his family. People like Gaetano Panozzo, who lived in Geelong, who came here in 1922. He was involved in militant anti-fascist activity in Italy. People like Francesco Camagnola, a great human being who I had the pleasure of meeting at the end of his life. So they came here, they tried to create a new life for themselves. But unlike 99% of immigrants, they didn't leave their home behind. They didn't come here because they were aspirational. They came here for their survival. And they understood that Australia was going through its enormous transformation. We saw fascist activity, not only in the Italian community, but in the general community. If you look at the history of the late 1920s and 1930s, look at the history of the New Guard, an underground military force in this country that was here to protect us from communist subversion. So, these men, and they were men, because in those days, you couldn't bring your wife. They left their families behind. And maybe they brought them 5 years, 6 years, 10 years later, when things had settled a bit. They made it their business. They made it their business to tell Australians about the Holocaust which was going to befall them before the war began. 3 of them, Francesco Fantini, Francesco Camagnola, it's a very common name, Francesco, my father was called Francesco, Frank, or what's the you Italians help me out, Frank, Francesco, Ciccio, that's the nickname, Ciccio, yeah, the nickname. So, and Isidoro Bertoni. They formed the Matteotti Club. What was the Matteotti Club? Those of you who have scant knowledge of history remember the socialist parliamentarian who was murdered by the fascists in 1925 because he was a thorn in Mussolini's side. And here we have anarchists taking on the name for their club for a socialist parliamentarian. What was the purpose of the Matteotti Club? Initially it was in Spring Street, then it was transferred in 1928 to the Horticultural Hall across the road from Trades Hall. Melbourne Trades Hall was a hive of racism against the Italian workers, because the Italian workers were seen as competition for these lowly paid jobs, as we see today. And why is that? Because during the mid and late 1920s, Stanley Bruce was the Prime Minister, and he was trying to create an economy which was based on low wages and export driven. And those of you who know your Australian history, remember that 1928 was an exceptionally important period. There were bombings in Melbourne of the Greek Club, sorry, Greeks, and when you were harbouring blacklegs, they used to call them the scabs in those days, and so the Greek Club and a number of other things, because what had happened was there was a huge waterside workers' dispute, and the government wanted to destroy the Waterside Workers' Federation. And it did that through a change of legislation where it required, on a Commonwealth basis, for waterside workers to be registered. And anybody could apply. And they formed scab unions around the country. There was a huge confrontation among workers in the late 1920s. We saw riots, we saw strikes, we saw Alan Whittaker, an Anzac veteran, a man who was a Gallipoli veteran, shot dead by Victoria Police at Princess Pier in 1928 because he was involved in a strike against the strike breakers, trying to break up the strike breakers entering the walls. So you've got this huge amount of activity going on. So the Matteotti Club transferred to the Horticultural Hall across the road from Melbourne Trades Hall to influence Australian workers, to influence Australian unionists. They didn't do it with speeches, boring speeches like this one. They did it by holding balls, by selling alcohol, by having dances. And the Matteotti Club had a significant impact on the ideas which were in vogue at that particular point in time by British trade unions, Australian trade unionists, about these just being scabs who come here to take our jobs. Now when John Howard has a very, very important place in Australian history. He is the second Australian Prime Minister to lose his seat in an election because of his work choices legislation, anti-work choice legislation. Stanley Bruce was the first, he was the member for Flinders, he was the first Australian Prime Minister who lost his seat in the 1929 drubbing of the Nationalists. And as luck would have it, a Labor government comes in at the very beginning of the Depression. Now, the Depression had a profound impact on these men because many of them lost their jobs. Many of them were skilled textile workers, so they moved up en masse to the cane fields to be cheap labour. And what they found there, they found incredible. They found a burgeoning fascist movement amongst the Italian immigrants in North Queensland. A movement which was actually sponsored to a large degree and financed by the Mussolini government. There were doctors there who were being paid by the Mussolini government who had fascist sympathies. There was money and business opportunities for Italians to be involved in fascist clubs. So as these little fascist loci of Piccolo grew, we saw the communists, the anarchists, the socialists, and various other groups create progressive clubs. So in a little town you may have had the fascist club and the progressive club, and you can imagine the tension in these communities. What happened is that eventually the anarchist Francesco Camagnola, who was one of the leading activists, would physically confront Mussolini's consuls and vice-consuls and officials here in Australia, and they would ask them to remove their fascist badges, and if they didn't, they would be physically assaulted. Now, a very important situation happened, I think it was in England, in mid-1930s, where Camagnola pulled the badge off the vice-consul, the Italian vice-consul in Townsville, because they had consuls all over Queensland at that stage. Because remember, of the 30,000 Italians here, almost 25,000 lived in North Queensland, north of Bundaberg in the cane fields. And he was arrested, obviously, charged, and guess what? He was acquitted. He was acquitted by Mr. Fred Paterson. Does anybody remember Fred Paterson? The communist member for Townsville. Parliamentarian. Communist member for Townsville. You wouldn't believe it. With the rise of divided nation, would you? But again, you've got to understand, there was little mechanisation. People needed workers. These workers were organised. Now, what was important in the Italian anarchist community was not just the physical interaction with the representatives of the Mussolini government here in Australia, but what was important is making contacts with local radicals, trade unionists, telling them what was about to come, explaining what fascism really meant. And things came to a head in 1934. And they came ahead regarding a particular important, maybe I should call this that. They came ahead because of a particular important industrial struggle. Now, I don't know if most of you know much about cane cutting. I do, and I know a little bit. The fact is that today, when they cut cane with machines, the cane is burnt. In 1934, the cane was not burnt, although evidence had come out that people were dying of Weil's disease, which is caused by leptospirosis, which is a bacteria which can be treated today with antibiotics, which was untreatable in 1934. People died of kidney failure. So when you went to work, you could be bitten by a snake and die because the cane fields hadn't been burnt. You could put your hand, you have a little cut on your hand, you put your hand in some water. If you've been to North Queensland, you know how wet it is. And you could get leptospirosis bacteria in that cut, and you could die just for the sake of cutting some cane. Now, some research had come out in 1934 which linked leptospirosis with the fact that the cane was not burnt. The Colonial Sugar Refinery, which still exists, CSR, refused to pay standard rates for cane that had been burnt. It paid a reduced rate. If you were able to force your employer to burn the cane, the difference in what the employer would receive would have to be deducted from your wages. It's true. I don't do fake news. I leave that to the Washington buffoon. Right? I don't do fake news. So what happened was that Francesco Camagnoli and a number of the anarchists there, the Dante brothers, Luigi and I think Alphonse, they organised a strike. And what happened? The Australian Workers' Union was against the strike because they had made a deal with the cane farmers that if they had 70% British labourers, that they would not do any industrial action whatsoever. So the anarchists, Francesco Camagnoli, Francesco Fantini, were instrumental in organising a strike, the strike which spread from Ingham right up through Townsville to Cairns, Binda, Innisfail, all the major sugar centres, Tully in North Queensland. But they didn't rely on just coming out and going home or lighting a fire and doing a little picket line. What they did is they went out in lorries, overturned lorries full of cane, which were driven by strike breakers. And within a month, they actually won that particular result. So hundreds, if not thousands, of lives of ordinary workers, both British and non-British, were saved as a result of this strike, which led to the burning of all sugarcane before it was harvested by hand. Now, the outbreak of World War II, I'll be finished soon. The outbreak of World War II changed everything because Italy was on the wrong side. Although Italy didn't join the war officially until June 1940, the Italian immigrants, whether naturalised or unnaturalised, were considered to be enemy aliens, and they were registered as enemy aliens, irrespective of their political convictions. And what we saw was 15% of the Italian population, over 3,500 from North Queensland, were interned. Men, women, children. And they were interned not because they were fascists, they were interned because they were Italians. Fortunately, I'm Sicilian, so I didn't have to worry. Although, unfortunately, my uncle was interned, Ignazio Toscano, who was interned as an 18-year-old. He was Sicilian, obviously. I didn't listen to him. They thought they were all Italians. But that's the joke scene. All Italians are fascists. So what we saw was people like Francesco Fantini, who'd been an active anti-fascist for the 20 years he was here, a foundation member of the Military Club, being involved in assaults against fascist officials, being hounded by the police, just by a side. Interestingly, the Commonwealth Police liaison with the Mussolini's police force, they kept dossiers on the activists, and they would go to the activists' families in Italy to put pressure on them to stop causing trouble. And I've got documents here which shows, like Gaetano Penzoni, 1930, the Italian consul writes to the police, the secret police, asking them for an update on this gentleman. So this was for all the activists. So somehow in 1942, February 1942, the big roundup which occurred then because things were going badly in Stalingrad, things were going badly in the North African campaign. I think Singapore had fallen, and the Australian authorities were very, very concerned about the possibility of a fifth column among the Italians. And to some degree, it was warranted and not warranted, because although Mussolini and his officials did all they could, most Italians who joined fascist organisations joined them because they'd have a dance or they'd get a business opportunity and make a bit of money on the side. But they built it up. So, he was arrested in February 1942. He was placed in initially at Camp Gaythorne near Brisbane and then transferred to Camp Lovedale, which was an internment camp in South Australia. He arrived there in late February 1942, Now, because there weren't a lot of soldiers around, the camps were actually run, not the perimeters outside, were actually run by the internees themselves. They were divided on the basis of nationality, Japanese, German, Italian. Now, the camp that Francesco Fantini was in, there were about 300 fascists and about 60 socialists and anarchists and communists. So because he refused to attend the fascist lectures in the evening, which were given by Dr. Pistoricelli, he was targeted. And when an influx of fascist sympathisers came into the camp from Kalgoorlie and Fremantle, a young man by the name of Giovanni Bruno Cassotti was instructed to do something good for the motherland and kill Francesco Fantini. So here we have a man who's dedicated his life to the anti-fascist cause, who's dedicated 20 years of his life in this country trying to alert Australian workers about the dangers of fascism, finding himself in this situation. Although the camp guards outside were aware of his plight and were sympathetic to his plight, the commanding officer was not that interested. So while he was bending over to drink from a tap, he was bludgeoned to death by 4v2 by Giovanni Bruno Cassotti. Now, he was wearing a tweed cap at the time. And you wonder, what's that got to do with it? It's got a lot to do with it. Because he sustained a massive skull fracture at the base of the skull and died within 6 hours of the assault. Now, Bruno Cassotti was arrested. He was originally charged with murder, which was a hanging offence in 1942. And then the charge was dropped manslaughter because the piece of wood had disappeared. All the witnesses had been coerced not to give evidence. And the doctor who did the post-mortem stated because there were no abrasions to the back of the skull, to the back of his head, most likely Giovanni Cassotti's story was true, that he just pushed it against the tap and he hit his head. Now, and you know what was important? Was he was wearing a tweed cap, like Joe over there. But he was wearing a tweed cap, and that cap prevented from abrasions from occurring. So Giovanni was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, then deported and came back to Perth in the 1950s. But the interesting thing was there were questions asked in Parliament by Fred Patterson. There was a revulsion on what was occurring. Many of the anti-fascists who had been interned were released before the end of the war, and no further anti-fascists, people like Francesco Camagnola, were actually interned. So there was some positive. Now, as I said before at the beginning, and I'm nearly finished, in history, you need to unwind things. Nothing is black and white. Nobody's a fascist, nobody's an anarchist. We're everything, we're intermixed. It's a little bit like being on the spectrum. You can be on one end or the other end, but there's all this intermixing. 15 years ago, through the work of George Venturi, who I'm not sure whether it's Dr. George Venturi, who wrote a book on 3 prominent anti-fascists in between the wars here in Australia, we came to the realisation that Francesco Fantini was buried in an ossuary in Murchison in Victoria. We didn't know that. People done PhDs of Francesco Fantini. So what had happened at the end of the war? 125 Italians, some prisoners of wars, some internees died in the camps. Some were shot while trying to escape, some were murdered, some died of disease. There's an 8-month-old baby and one woman, civilian internee, buried at Murchison. So we went there about 15 years ago, just to see what was on. And there were hundreds of people there on Armistice Day,
to show some respect for the people interned in the ossuary. It wasn't an ossuary where you throw all the bones together. Every individual was named and they had their own grave. Because what happened in the 1950s is the Italian community based in Shepparton raised money to bring the bodies of all the internees that had died and place them in one place so their families could mourn their death on one day, which was the Sunday nearest Armistice Day. And they collected money, a shilling here, 5 shillings there, to create a chapel for them. And for 14 years, we turn up, little gang of us. We'd be very nice, very pleasant, go to church, listen to mass, do all the right things, and then at the end, we would do a little ceremony for Francesco Fantini. And 2 years ago, one of the Alpini, one of the retired soldiers, came and spoke to us, and he wanted us to join the official march, because the official march, you've got all these Italian communities, which you're all aware of today, which support different factions within the Italian armed forces, who march on the Sunday nearest to Armistice Day, because the cemetery in Murchison is a recognised Italian war cemetery, the only recognised war cemetery in this country, outside Australian war cemeteries. And so we began discussion with the organisers regarding taking part in the march, but not to remember individuals, because we'll still do our ceremony, but to remember the internees. Now, could I get 2 young people here to hold up this banner? No, not you, you're doing something useful. Or maybe 2 old people. Now, if you grab that banner, and it's an extraordinary picture. Here we go. And last year, we unofficially broke the drought, and although we've been refused permission under the protection of the Alpini, we marched at the end to highlight that what is at Murchison are not just armed forces personnel. They are internees, most of them not fascists, not communists, not anarchists, just ordinary Italians going about their business, trying to make a living despite the overt racism that occurred at that period. And this is a picture of them leaving the camp to go on a work division. So, if any of you have got the time, there's an invitation. We're not here. If any of you have got the time, I think it's on the 8th of November this year, which will be the Sunday nearest, we'd like you to come. Come at 10. The ossuary is only open one day a year, and it's closed at 11. Pay your respects to Francesco Fantini, who paid the ultimate price for his resistance. Then, if you're a Catholic, a good Catholic, you can have Holy Communion. If not, you just hang around. And at the end of the church service, join us to honour the civilian internees. Because ultimately, they're all equal. They could have been a fascist general, a conscripted Italian who came out here, who was captured as a prisoner of war. It could have been a woman, internee, a young baby, a man who didn't even, just came to make a living. But because of government policy, not being able to discriminate in the community, and because of lumping everybody together, like all the Muslims, all the blacks, all the Chinese, that same mentality pervades today, they paid the ultimate price. So thank you for listening. It went a bit longer than I expected. questions is.
This might be a really simple question, but apart from the real or perceived benefits of identifying as a fascist at the time, why would, you know, an everyday Italian person decide to side with the fascists here in Australia and there? And why?
Well, one, you've got family in Italy. That's the most important thing. And if you stray, as we see in Iran, if you stray, the pressure can be placed on your family. So if a fascist club is organised in your district, for you not to join would be seen as disloyal. Information would go to the consul would send information back to the police, the secret police in Italy. They would knock on your mother's door, or your sister's door, or your brother's door. The second thing was, because of the overt racism in North Queensland, many Italians believed that the only way they could protect themselves was through joining these people, these clubs, little fascist clubs, which mainly, all they did basically was celebrate Mussolini's birthday. Or there are a few of the clubs which were really nasty, like the Babinda Club, that had real fascists. Dr. Pisticelli was a well-known fascist. He was the leader of Camp Loveday. He was responsible for Francesco Fantini's death. But the majority of people, it's like any country. Say we had a fascist government here tomorrow, how many of us are really going to resist? It's all very well mouthing slogans. It's another thing becoming a partisan. So that's the main reason. It was in their interests. The Italians were not able to integrate or assimilate in North Queensland because they weren't wanted. They were seen as competition. As the Italians got more and more resources, they began to buy up soldier settlement farms which had failed. So they were owning cane farms. They were displacing the original European, British owners. They were disliked by the trade unions because they were considered to be a cheap labour source. So they felt that the best way they could survive, and not making any excuses, was to join the clubs. But they were really of no real threat. I'll tell you a little story. When I was about 7, my dad used to take me to Fortitude Valley. I was born in Brisbane, which was the Italian Badlands in those days, because they had a cappuccino machine. And you'd get a limonata, right? And you have all these Italian men. Obviously the women would stay home, culturally, not acceptable. There were a few, but I remember. And this beautifully dressed man like me, he dropped this coin on the ground, and being a little tacker, ran up, picked up the coin, and I gave it to him. And he said, "Give it to the boy, give it to the boy." When I was doing research, I found out that this was Dr. Castellano. This was a fascist doctor in North Queensland who rebadged himself as a progressive community leader. And that's what happened. As the circumstances change, people change their opinions in order to survive and prosper. Any more questions? I know there's more speakers. Yes.
I was just wondering if you know of any numbers where the POWs that were based in a few camps, I think in Yorkshire, England, how many came out to Australia after World War II, and maybe 45, 46, because I think they were held between 46. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yeah. Some of them came out, but what was more interesting, many of the prisoners of war were held in camps around Shepparton and Tatura and Murchison, the large prisoners of war camps. They came back to take up farming in the Shepparton district after the war. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Joe. My name is Pierre. Always very interesting. The question I want to say is, from your opinion, obviously you've talked a lot about the anti-racism, anti-fascist and the racist. issues of the 1930s, and obviously have got lots of, like in the present, you see all those themes going up, and you've talked about how history is important, and history has to be, we have to rediscover it. Why do you think that throughout our history here in Australia, because that is only one movement, there were lots of movements in 2030, lots of organisations and communities have fought and blah, blah, blah. Why does it always seem to be forgotten, and each decade that issues come up, and just recently, with Hanson, the migrants, and you think, you've got to go back 80 years, exactly the same words.
Because our children and their children are aspirational. We have made them into perfect Australians. I'll give you an example. I befriended Bruno Vanini. We've done a wonderful job because they've integrated, they've gone to university or tech college, they've got good jobs, they got mortgages. They're not interested in this shit. All right? And that's the reason. And if you talk to them about it, they go, I've got to pay the mortgage, I've got to go to work. I'll give you an example if I can remember of this aspirational stuff. Bruno Vanini, he was a activist, fascist, anti-fascist. I befriended him in the 1980s, and I think he was the last Italian anarchist, from the early days that died here. And we'd have coffee occasionally in his house, and he was looking after his wife who had Alzheimer's, which was very difficult for him. But he did the right thing. He'd take me out to the back, and there was this huge barn, bigger than this. He had a beautiful block in Surrey Hills. He had been collecting anarchist literature for 35 years. He had over 4,000 separate publications. And he said to me, Joe, I want to donate this to the Anarchist Spirit Institute when I die, right? I eventually found out he died. Nobody told us, and I contacted some relatives. They said, that garbage, we put it in a dumpster and dumped it all. So what I'm saying to you is, as Francesco Camignoli said on his deathbed in February 1982 in Sydney, he said, I'm saddened that all the sacrifices and actions we've taken have achieved almost nothing. I leave it up to your grandchildren. I leave it up to my grandchildren. We were his grandchildren 40 years ago. Now you are his grandchildren. Because we've done a wonderful job with our kids. They're successful. Some of them have even got honours, Australian honours. I think that is the answer. And that's